Today is Saturday, July 15th, and this is William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. In the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, we primarily serve homeschooling families. Interest from private schools is increasing and is going to increase rapidly once we finish with the accreditation process. But most of the families we deal with, most of the students I deal with are homeschool students from all over the place. Nevertheless, I don't spend much time actually talking to homeschool families. My family, for example, is not involved in any local homeschool activities or groups. And Dania and I rarely talk with Catholic homeschooling families. In our parish, I don't even think anyone in our parish knows what we do because we just keep things quiet and focus on worship. We really don't get into much social activity, don't talk about business or any of the work we do. When I do, however, talk to Catholic homeschool parents, I really can't figure out what they're doing. I really can't comprehend how they think about education as Catholics, especially as homeschoolers. I've explained this before in other talks, but it really looks like homeschooling was initiated, the homeschooling movement of like the 1990s, maybe 1980s, if it goes back even that far. But 1990s, homeschooling seemed to pick up, and it was driven, it seems, by Protestant organizations. And again, I've done whole talks about this before, but I really feel like the homeschool crowd, the homeschool market, is heavily influenced by Protestants. And Catholics either use Protestant study materials or they just sort of develop knockoff copies of Protestant ideas. I explained how the whole Mother of Divine Grace curriculum that Laura Berquist put together is really nothing more than a Protestant idea about education with some of the materials swapped out with Catholic stuff. If you were to ask the folks at Mother of Divine Grace, where did your idea for this curriculum come from? They would point back to a Protestant. They might have some quotes on the website from Aristotle, but what they're doing has nothing to do with Aristotle, has nothing to do with Thomas Aquinas or any Catholic schools of the past. It's really just a Catholic edition of the Dorothy Sayers Protestant 3 stages of learning curriculum. And when I look at Catholic homeschool families, they're studying with Protestant study materials. And I just can't wrap my head around this for even a second. I can't imagine spending money on a Protestant book. I can't imagine giving money to a Protestant publisher. Would you ever think of stopping by and making a donation to a local Protestant church as a Catholic? Would you ever sign your kids up for the local Protestant vacation Bible school at the Baptist church? Would you send your kids to a Protestant school? I would never even think of doing that. And it really doesn't make any sense because Catholic educational resources are limitless. There's 2,000 years of Catholic educational resources. And yet somehow, Catholic parents end up buying Protestant books for their kids to study. I just can't understand what the thinking is. If I was a Catholic parent, and I am a Catholic parent, I would be on Microsoft Word typing my own study materials before I would ever send my family's money to a Protestant organization. Do you think the Protestant organizations and Protestant families, do you think they send money to Catholic organizations? Do you think they buy Catholic resources? Of course they don't. They would look at a Catholic book and immediately say, oh, this is Catholic. We're not buying this. It's Catholic. But somehow the Catholics don't think like that. And I'm sure that the booksellers and many of the book buyers will have some kind of quick response to that. But that's a red flag that something's wrong. Something's wrong. Something's wrong philosophically. Something's wrong academically. Something's wrong with the curriculum plan. Something's wrong with the goals of a study program where Catholic parents are buying Protestant books. And this seems to be found where we're dealing with this fake classical education, which is just a plague that I really don't know how to get people away from. You've got a generation of publishers that have just invented an idea out of thin air about how education should work, what it should look like, and so on. And they've labeled it classical education, even though it's never existed anywhere in history. They present it to families and to kids as some kind of proven, tried and trustworthy method of education. And it just comes out of nowhere. It has nothing to do with the 2,000 years of Catholic education. 2,000 years where saints not only studied, but taught and published study materials in Catholic schools in the light of Catholic theology and philosophy for Catholic students. Yet none of that material is used by Catholic families, and they're buying Protestant books in the 21st century to give their kids a classical education. Protestantism didn't even exist throughout most of church history. Protestantism was invented in the 1500s. No one in the Middle Ages was a Protestant. There were no Protestant schools in the 1200s. How have Catholics become dependent on Protestants for their study materials? Now, If they were good study materials, I would understand. We could say, well, Catholics don't publish anything. Who knows what they're doing? But the Protestants here, they've produced some really quality stuff. High quality study materials. But that's not true. These aren't quality study materials. It's just encyclopedic junk. It's not classical liberal arts. It's not anything that any wise men would ever have taught or studied. It comes from a completely different philosophy of education, a Protestant philosophy. And I guess in America, in a country that was designed by Protestants, where the culture is Protestant, the way of thinking is Protestant, the spirit is Protestant, even the Catholics think like Protestants. And all I ask Catholics to do is to just reason a little bit. Just reason. When you talk about classical education, what are you really talking about? Because I don't think that what you're thinking and what you're doing go together. When you talk about classical education, don't you have an idea that you want to give your children the kind of education that St. Augustine would have had, or St. Jerome, St. Ambrose, St. John Chrysostom, St. Bernard of Clairvaux, Boethius, famous Catholic scholar of the Middle Ages, St. Thomas Aquinas, St. Bonaventure, whose feast day is today? Isn't that what you mean when you say a classical Catholic education? Don't you mean the kind of timeless, traditional, theological, philosophical education that was enjoyed by Catholic students all throughout church history? Isn't that what you mean? Isn't that what you're interested in for your children and for yourself? Are you really interested in something that couldn't possibly have existed before the 1500s and was never known in any Catholic schools anywhere? That can't possibly be what you mean. You can't possibly mean, when you say you want to give your children a classical Catholic education, you can't possibly mean that you want your kids to follow an educational plan that was invented by a lady named Dorothy Sayers, whom you know nothing about, who was an Anglican feminist in the 1900s. That can't be what you mean when you say you want your children to have a classical Catholic education. Don't you mean that you want your children to enjoy the education that wise men and saints enjoyed all through church history? Isn't that what you really want? And if that's what you want, does what you're doing make any sense? If you were to look at what your children are studying and ask yourself, did the saints study this stuff? Is this how the saints studied? Are these the books the saints wrote for us? Are these the books the saints studied and taught? Because these study materials don't change. St. Thomas Aquinas lived in the 1200s, and he was studying and teaching in the University of Paris. He was teaching Aristotle, who wrote 400 years before Christ. 1,600 years after Aristotle lived, St. Thomas Aquinas was teaching Aristotle in the midst of medieval Europe. These study materials don't change. The great philosophical works don't get replaced. The classical liberal arts don't need new textbooks and new editions. These things are timeless. So when you look at what your children are doing, can you answer the question, why are they doing that? Why do you have them using these modern books? Why do you have them using books that aren't even Catholic books? Do you really believe that there's no Catholic study materials available? You really believe that these Protestant books are the only thing available? And if you don't know, if you say, well, I didn't have a classical education myself, I've never had a chance to really study the history of education, I really don't know what's available. Don't you think you should stop and ask someone? Don't you think you should ask someone? Or are you just going to keep running without finding out if there is something better? If Catholic study materials are available, wouldn't that make more sense than just getting in line at the Protestant bookstore, looking around at what the Protestant moms are buying and buying that for your Catholic kids? Does that really make any sense? I don't know what Catholic homeschool families are thinking. I really can't comprehend what they're thinking. There are many Catholic families that provide their children with a modern education, a modern K-12 math and science education, and they use a program like Seton Home Study. Again, I don't understand why Catholics would use study materials like Seton, a modern K-12 program that follows a philosophy of education that was invented by non-Catholics, and put pictures of saints on the covers of their books and all through the books, as if that changes the nature of the studies, when the images of those saints bear witness against them, because anyone who would simply reason about the chronology would know that those saints whose pictures are on the books never studied with study materials like these. And I don't just mean they didn't use modern materials, obviously, but they didn't study materials with this content. And there's reasons why they didn't do so. And maybe you don't understand what those reasons are, but don't you think you should ask someone? Don't you think you should take out that Seton book and look at the picture of the saint on the cover or in the middle of the book and ask, when did that saint live? What did that saint study? What were the books like? What were the schools like when that saint was alive? Doesn't that thought ever come across your mind? Rather than saying, oh, look, I have a book with a picture of a saint. It must be good. I can remember being a little kid in elementary school and being taught, never judge a book by its cover. Never judge a book by its cover. We were taught that the quality of a book is determined by its content, not by the pictures in the book, not by the cover, on the book, but by the quality of the content of the book. Don't Catholics believe that that's true? Don't Catholics believe that you shouldn't judge a book by its cover? I would think that that was true for Catholics, but it doesn't seem that Catholics think that's true. And I'm not trying to be mean to anyone. I'm not trying to be judgmental or make anyone feel uncomfortable, because I can tell you what the answers are to these questions. And I'm willing to help you, and I'm willing to help your family. But I don't understand how Catholics are justifying doing what they're doing. I really don't understand. I don't understand how Catholics are using Protestant books and referring to the education as classical and Catholic when it's both modern and non-Catholic. What do the labels mean? What does classical mean? What does Catholic mean if the book is Protestant? And I know some will say, well, these subjects are neutral. These subjects are neutral. Mathematics is neutral. The natural sciences are neutral. You can't have a Catholic science book. You can't have a Catholic math book. Are you sure about that? Are you really sure that that's true? Are you really sure that science is neutral? Whoever taught you that? What saint have you ever read who said, school studies like math and science, English, language arts, foreign language, these studies are neutral. It doesn't matter who the teacher is. It doesn't matter who writes the book. Doesn't matter who publishes the book. These studies are all neutral. Have you ever heard any wise man, any Catholic doctor or saint ever suggest anything like that? If not, then why would you say that? Why would you think to assert these subjects are neutral? It doesn't matter what math book you use. It doesn't matter how you study the natural world. It doesn't matter how you study mathematics. These subjects are all neutral. Let me ask you, have you ever studied ancient mathematics? Have you ever studied ancient arithmetic? Like the Introduction to Arithmetic by Nicomachus, an ancient philosopher? You may have studied a modern school textbook, but have you ever studied an ancient mathematics book? If not, then how can you assert that there's no difference? Have you ever studied Euclid's geometry? If you've only studied geometry in a modern school textbook, how can you say there's no difference? Have you ever studied natural philosophy? Have you ever studied Aristotle's History of Animals or Theophrastus's History of Plants? Have you ever studied Aristotle's Physics or Metaphysics? If not, how can you say the study of natural sciences is neutral when the only thing that you've ever studied are modern books? The truth is, these subjects are not neutral. And yet, Catholic parents, Catholic schools, Catholic school teachers go around saying these things. Oh, these subjects are neutral. we've got all these Catholics making all of these assertions, using labels for things, names for things, doing things that I really don't believe they could ever explain the reasoning behind. And then at the end of this educational program, we see a Catholic society that has no religious vocations, very few virtuous graduates going out, and even if they're not choosing to be priests or not choosing religious vocations, even if they go into the world, we don't see them fulfilling the ministry or role of the laity and directing temporal affairs according to God's will. We see them just getting in line with all the public school kids who have no education, wrestling with them over the same stuff. And if we would just think about what Jesus taught us when he said, "Do not seek the things the Gentiles seek." When we read that and then look at Catholic society and then go back and read that, "Do not seek the things the Gentiles seek," and then look back to Catholic society, are we not seeking the things the Gentiles seek? What else could possibly be said of what we're doing? We are literally seeking what the Gentiles seek. And we're seeking it for the same reasons that they're seeking it. And I know Catholic parents will say, well, our kids have to go to college. Our kids have to prepare for careers in modern workforce. That sounds great, but is it true? Is that true? That's not true. It's not true that your kids have to go to college. It's not true that your kids have to be prepared for the modern. That's not true. So why are you saying that? Why are you using that as an excuse to make decisions and choices that don't make any sense? And I know that some may disagree or scoff at me and say, you just don't understand. You just don't understand. Well, here's how I'm going to prove that you don't understand. I'm going to prove that those who say these things, Catholics who say these things, don't actually understand. This year, I'm going to have the Classical Liberal Arts Academy accredited. And no one is going to understand how in the world the Classical Liberal Arts Academy can be accredited. In fact, ever since I started the academy, I've constantly had to hear this from homeschool parents. The Classical Liberal Arts Academy is just too strange. It's too old-fashioned. It's not for modern society, blah, blah, blah. And you've all been wrong who have said that, because you don't know what you're talking about. You don't understand what classical Catholic education is. You don't understand that classical Catholic education is actually superior to any modern education. And you're going to see that when the Classical Liberal Arts Academy inexplicably gets accredited by a modern accreditation agency. All of these excuses, all of these ignorant assertions about how that doesn't work today, that's not appropriate for today, that doesn't prepare kids for modern college studies and modern careers, all of these assertions that homeschool parents have made about the Classical Liberal Arts Academy are going to be proven false this year. The accreditation agents understand. The Catholic homeschool parents don't understand. The Catholic private school administrators don't understand. Thankfully, the Catholic, not Catholic. Thankfully, the secular accreditation agents understand. And just try to think about this. The Classical Liberal Arts Academy is run by two people. It serves over 2,400 students presently. It offers over 90 online courses. And again, it's being run by two people. It costs almost nothing to use. The curriculum offered in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy can't even be compared to a modern school. Teachers in modern schools, administrators in modern schools, wouldn't even understand what our courses are, because what they're dealing with is so far inferior to what the real classical Catholic curriculum consists of. They've got massive school facilities, whole armies of teachers, faculties with all kinds of teaching licenses being paid tens of thousands of dollars a year, schools with multi-million-dollar budgets. And you're going to watch a study program that's run by two people receive the same accreditation. Our enrollment plan costs a student $300 per year. And that's the only cost, unless you need to buy a Chromebook, which might cost you another, let's be generous and say $200. The classical Catholic curriculum costs almost nothing, requires almost nothing, and stands entirely on the merit of its own content, because it's truth and wisdom. And like I said, God willing, this year, the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, as crazy as it may look, as strange as it may look, as outdated as it may look to people who don't study it, it's going to receive the same modern accreditation of the modern non-Catholic study programs that they claim are necessary for accreditation, for college admission, for career preparation, and so on. And they're 100% wrong. And these same people who will make assertions about classical Catholic studies from the past are contradicted by secular accreditation agents. They're contradicted by college admissions representatives who admit students who study the classical liberal arts. They're contradicted by everyone that they claim to be seeking approval from, and yet they go on as Catholics with Protestant books, modern non-Catholic books, subjects and courses that no saints ever studied or taught in their schools, while omitting the subjects that the saints and wise men taught us to be essential for Catholic education. And there's no way to explain it. There's no way to explain what Catholic parents are doing. And I'm very excited because, as I said, this coming year, we're going to prove that it's all false. Because the Academy, teaching the 7 classical liberal arts, using no new books, every book we use in our curriculum is an old book in the public domain. The accreditation agents look at our program, interview us, go over all of our documentation and say, this is great. This looks wonderful. But the Catholics, whose curriculum it is, whose heritage it is, don't understand it and dismiss it as if it's something silly, as if I'm promoting some Amish textbooks to be used. Oh, wait a minute. Actually, the Catholic homeschoolers do use Amish textbooks, but they won't use classical Catholic books that were actually studied by saints and wise men in church history. And if you think I'm exaggerating when I say that Catholic homeschoolers will use Amish textbooks, Amish, by the way, are heretics, they're Anabaptists. It's just another version of crazy Protestants. If you don't think that I'm telling the truth, go online and Google Rod and Staff Publishing, and you'll find the Amish, or I should say to be more accurate, Mennonite curriculum series that's used by Catholic homeschoolers. And this just makes no sense. Now, some will ask, well, does the Classical Liberal Arts Academy use any non-Catholic materials? And the answer is yes and no. Yes, we do use materials that are published or written by men who were not Catholics. For example, Aristotle's not a Catholic. He lived 400 years before Christ. Euclid is not a Catholic. Cicero is not a Catholic. Seneca is not a Catholic. However, those men lived before the Catholic Church and taught true philosophy, which was embraced as true philosophy by the doctors of the Catholic Church. You'll also find some modern books in our program, older books but relatively modern, like our World History series. Our World History series provides students with a survey of world history. You'll also see that we have a whole set of courses available for students to study through the Cambridge Ancient and Medieval and Modern Histories. Now, why these are selected, there's a reason in our program why a book is selected, and that reason can be explained. The Cambridge histories, if you look, were edited by men who were either Anglo-Catholic or Catholic. And so they are careful to respect Catholic truth. For example, if you read chapters in the Cambridge medieval history on the Catholic Church, you'll find them to be very accurate and fair. So even if our program does use a book, there's a reason for it, and it's been verified to make sure that it actually teaches what Catholic students should be learning. It's not just a book that happens to be available in the Homeschool catalog. Our books are carefully chosen for their content. They're carefully chosen for their historical use. They're carefully chosen for their methods. And sometimes they're carefully chosen to serve a specific need in our program. One example is that in our elementary courses, we offer students the McGuffey's Readers as a reading program. And someone will say, well, the McGuffey's Readers were made by Protestants, and that's true and false. The original McGuffey's Readers were published for heavily Protestant public schools in the 1800s. But the revised McGuffey Readers were revised so that that Protestant influence was removed. So if you refer to the McGuffey's Readers as a Protestant book, and you're not careful to clarify that the revised McGuffey's Readers had the Protestant influence removed, you're false. We wouldn't use them if they were simply published by Protestants for Protestants. And someone could say, well, that's what we're doing because we're using, let's say, Memoria Press to teach Latin. Are you teaching Latin? Let me ask you this. Think with me. Can you reason with me? What interest do Protestants have in the Latin language? What does the Latin language have to do with Protestantism? Do you remember the arguments of the Protestants? The Catholic Church worshipped God in Latin. The official Bible of the Catholic Church was the Latin Vulgate. The monasteries prayed in Latin. The academies and universities taught in Latin. Government offices conducted business in Latin. The common people didn't speak Latin. The common people didn't read Latin. The Protestants were the ones who complained that the use of Latin was evil. It was a way of oppressing the common people and preventing them from reading the Bible. Don't you remember that? And so the Protestants were the ones who insisted on translating the Bible into their own vernacular languages and getting rid of the Latin language. So let me ask you, if they were getting rid of the Latin language in the 1600s, what interest do Protestants have in the Latin language in the 21st century? It makes no sense. Now, if you press some Protestants for answers, they're not going to say something like, oh, well, Latin is one of the languages that the church fathers wrote in. They're not going to say that. They're not going to say, well, Latin is the sacred language of the Christian faith. They're not going to say that. They're going to give you all kinds of nonsense answers for why the study of Latin is helpful, because it helps build vocabulary, because it raises SAT scores, because it challenges kids to use critical thinking. This is all a bunch of baloney. That's not why anyone ever studied Latin. And it's certainly not why Catholics should be studying Latin. So when we look at the Latin books published by Protestant publishers, they're not even designed to serve the Catholic interest in the Latin language. So no, it doesn't make any sense why a Catholic would use a Protestant Latin book. That makes no sense at all. The goals of a Protestant Latin curriculum are not the goals of a Catholic Latin curriculum. And again, these subjects are not neutral. The goals are different, which causes the methods and the content to be different. It's not all neutral. And you should know that simply because Catholics shouldn't be studying Protestant books. And even simpler than that, Protestants should not be receiving money from Catholic parents for study materials. Catholics should not be supporting and building up Protestant publishing companies. Could you imagine explaining this to Catholics living in the 1600s? Could you imagine explaining to St. Teresa of Avila or St. John of the Cross or St. Ignatius of Loyola? Could you imagine explaining to them that you buy your children's books from a Protestant publisher? They would look at you like you're crazy. In that generation, the Catholic Church was burning Catholic books that weren't careful to teach the Catholic faith. And in our generation, Catholics are buying Protestant books. Can you even comprehend how we've come to this place? It makes no sense. And I understand the intentions of Catholic parents. I don't agree with a lot of their intentions because I really don't think they understand what they're doing. I understand their general intention that they want to quote unquote raise saints, but what they're doing doesn't make sense if that's the goal. It doesn't make any sense. If you want to give your kids a real classical Catholic education, the real thing, if you want them to study the same books that saints and wise men studied in history, and I'm not really focused on elementary level stuff because that stuff, the kids get through that into more advanced stuff if they're allowed to. If their whole education isn't just bogged down with all of this elementary nonsense, they should be getting into philosophical studies, into the classical liberal arts. They should be getting into theology studies. And yet we find Catholic students struggling even in high school. I've seen teenage kids who can't spell and can barely write because of all of this kooky homeschool stuff. And these parents have spent hundreds, if not thousands of dollars on a million different goofy textbooks and workbooks and programs that were never used in history, obviously. And it's like no one stops to ask, is there a better way? Is there a better way? And yes, there is a better way. The same way that was known all through church history. All of the resources are still available. All of the resources are still perfectly relevant. And again, the proof of that is going to be our accreditation, which no one is going to be able to explain. It's all the same, it's all relevant, and most importantly, it's better than anything that non-Catholics can produce. And Catholics have to stop playing in the gutter with all of this junk and get to their own study materials. Get to their own philosophical studies. Get to their own curriculum materials. Get to their own methods of study. And get out of this modern secular Protestant homeschool catalog with all of this garbage that has kids spending 12 years of their childhood to barely get through what public schools get kids through whose parents couldn't even tell you what courses they're studying in school. They may not even have parents. And they're getting the same things done as Catholic homeschool parents, where two parents, usually degree-earning, educated, wealthy parents, focused on their education, are spending thousands and thousands of private dollars and barely accomplishing anything different than the kids getting dropped off by the bus at the public school are getting. And that's not an exaggeration. You can go look at the Seton website. Imagine the investment being made by Catholic homeschool families in all of this Seton homeschool material, in all of the time spent at home working with the children, and to see Seton advertise on the front of the website that their modern homeschool curriculum, the average scores are a few points higher than the average public school SAT scores. That's really the standard? A few points higher on the SAT after all of that investment of homeschooling? It makes no sense. And Catholic parents have to stop settling for this ridiculous emperor's new clothes homeschool market. They have to stop settling for this and realize Catholic schools were the best schools in the history of the world. Catholic schoolmasters and teachers were the best teachers the world has ever known. Books that were produced by these Catholic doctors and schoolmasters were the greatest study materials ever produced. And Catholic families today have no idea where they even are, because they're buying books from Protestant publishers, or they're using the same books that the public schools are using. It makes no sense. There's no way to explain it. You could say, well, maybe it's more. No, it's more expensive. They're not saving money. They're spending more money. There's simply no way to explain what Catholic homeschool parents are doing. And I'm not being critical. I'm trying to help. I'm trying to help. I've been a classicist for 25 years. I've worked in classical education for over 20 years. We built the Classical Liberal Arts Academy to restore real classical Catholic education. We've spent the last 15 years researching, recovering lost materials, putting lost materials back into print, making them accessible to students anywhere in the world, and doing so for a fraction of the cost of any other educational program. And it's all available to Catholic families. It's all available. I simply don't understand why Catholic parents don't ask for help. Don't stop what they're doing, which obviously makes no sense, and simply asks for help. What should we do? What do you recommend? What did the saints do? What books did they use? How did they study? How can we give this education to our kids? If homeschool parents would just ask, I would give them access to the curriculum for free. I would teach their kids for free. But they won't even ask. And when they're corrected, they usually respond with an insane arrogance, digging their heels in and defending their errors, instead of just admitting, I need help. You've studied classical Catholic education for over 20 years. What should I do? What are my options? How can I do it? What should my kids study? If they would just ask, I could explain everything to them. In fact, I've already explained it. If this is the first time you're hearing anything from me, there's a free book available on the Classical Liberal Arts Academy website. If you go to classicalliberalarts.com and scroll down the front page of the website, you'll see that there's a free book you can download. It's titled Understanding Classical Catholic Education. I put those lessons together for Catholic parents. They're very simple, they're very clear, and it will explain everything. It's free. You have no excuse. In fact, those same lessons in that free book are also available in a free online course with assignments that ask you to write some responses to the readings that are submitted to me, which I'll review and give you feedback on. If you want to take that course, it's free online. Just go to the Classical Liberal Arts Academy Study Center, classicalliberalarts.com/study. Scroll all the way down to the bottom of the Study Center page, and you'll see there's a training section, and there's a course titled Preceptor Training. That's a free course. If you want to fix these things, I'm willing to help you. My wife, who's also a classicist, she's also willing to help you. But we can't just keep on going down this ridiculous road, doing things that make no sense, enriching Protestant publishers. It makes no sense. How in the world are we justifying this? There's no need for Catholic families to use Protestant study materials. There's no explanation for why Catholic families are not enjoying the incredible, the incomparable educational opportunities that are available to them with historical Catholic resources. You can give your children the same education that saints enjoyed in your own home in the 21st century for $25 a month. It costs nothing. It just makes no sense why we're not doing it. And if we get this going, if we get behind this and support it and promote it and use it, you're going to see, as I'm already proving, you're going to see that the secular world will reward it. Not that that's our motive. Our motive is to simply glorify God and teach the truth. But the secular world understands the value of these studies and can see the difference that they make. The accreditation agents couldn't stop praising the parents who they met with and interviewed from our program and the students, because they could see that there's an alignment among our students and parents that's not found in other places. And it's possible because we have a real curriculum. We have a real course of studies that unites us, that we can really invest in. And I'm not talking financially, I'm talking personally invest in and reap the rewards of. And people on the outside looking in can see the difference. Throughout history, Catholic education led the way. Christians are supposed to be the light of the world, especially those who are Catholic, because we're the ones who have the sacraments. In modern education, Catholics are not leading the way. They're following, literally. And we need to change that, and we can change that. But we've got to stop doing things that make no sense. And at the very least, ask for help. I hope that's helpful. God bless.